A piercing scream cut through the night, sharp enough to silence even the restless dogs in the alleys. Emily, an 18-year-old girl with tired eyes and torn clothes, stumbled out of the crumbling shack she called home. The storm raged, thunder rattling the walls, and lightning flashed across the darkened sky, illuminating her trembling face. Her hands clutched a broken photograph of her mother, her last link to the family that had abandoned her years ago. She whispered, "Why does the world always strike me down when I have nothing left to give?" Rain drenched her hair, soaking her patched dress, but she stood defiant, her breathing uneven. From the shadows a man's cold voice echoed, "You will never escape, girl." She spun around, heart pounding, eyes wide with fear. The towering figure of Mr. Grayson, the cruel landowner, emerged from the darkness, his boots sinking into the mud. His sneer cut into her soul. Emily's tears mixed with rain, but in her chest, something hardened, a spark of defiance born out of despair. This was the night everything would change. Emily ran through the flooded alleys, her bare feet slapping against mud. Each step echoed her desperation. The landowner's laughter chased her, sharp as a whip, piercing through the storm. "You'll never outrun me," he jeered. She gasped, lungs burning, clutching the soaked photograph to her chest. The lightning lit her path briefly, showing broken fences and fallen roofs. She stumbled but pushed forward, whispering to herself, "I can't stop, not now." The rain blurred her vision, but she refused to fall. The storm raged louder, as if nature itself fought against her, testing her will to survive. Thunder cracked so violently it shook her bones, and Emily ducked into an abandoned barn. The roof leaked, rain cascading down broken beams. She pressed against a wall, chest heaving, whispering, "Please, let him lose me." Her fingers tightened on the photograph, the ink smudged beyond recognition. She thought of her mother's voice, warm and soothing, guiding her through childhood hunger. Emily shivered, torn between fear and memory, her body trembling as the storm rattled the wooden walls around her. The barn door creaked, and Emily froze, heart pounding. A shadow stretched across the floor as Grayson's boots echoed closer. "Found you," he growled. Emily's pulse hammered, her breath shallow, yet she clenched her fists. She whispered, "I won't beg." The storm howled outside, shaking the structure like a warning. Grayson's silhouette filled the doorway, towering and merciless, his presence suffocating the space. Fear coursed through her veins, but in her chest, defiance sparked, fragile but alive. Emily's voice cracked as she stood slowly, every muscle quivering. She raised her chin, tears glistening in lightning flashes. "You've taken everything," she said, "but you won't take my spirit." Grayson laughed, deep and cruel, stepping forward. The barn walls groaned under the storm's assault, wood splintering with each gust. Emily clutched her chest, feeling the photograph dissolve into pulp, a symbol of her past vanishing. Yet, instead of breaking, her eyes burned with fire. For the first time, she felt the strength to fight back. Dawn crept over the soaked village, and Emily woke on a hay pallet, with rain still whispering. Her body ached, but the quiet felt like mercy after the storm. She brushed mud from her arms and murmured, "I am still here." The barn smelled of wet wood and old straw, a poor shelter that felt like defiance. She remembered the years of scrubbing floors and hauling water for coins. Mr. Grayson sneered in every memory, a shadow on her meals and sleep. Yet a stubborn dream clung to her ribs like breath. Emily said, "I want a life where I choose my hours." She pictured a room with a small desk, a lamp, and books. The thought warmed her like tea she could not afford. She stood, gathering resolve like a coat, and said, "Today, I begin again." Emily slipped into the waking market, where puddles reflected torn awnings and tired faces. She moved like a ghost between crates, heart steady, but wary. Vendors lifted tarps and counted wilted greens. A young man waved, cheerful despite the chill. "Morning, Emily," Jacob said. "Fresh bread ends if you trade work." She smiled, surprised by kindness. She stacked baskets and wiped the counter, fingers quick and sure. You should not be alone, Jacob said, eyes warm with concern. Emily answered, Alone keeps me safe. His grin faded, but he nodded. The smell of yeast and rain wrapped her like a fragile promise she dared not trust. When the crowd thickened, Emily ducked behind the stall and traced a memory with a muddy finger. She drew a tiny lamp on a crate, a symbol of nights she dreamed of study. You used to sing by lamplight, she whispered to the mother in her mind. The photograph was gone, but the voice returned like a gentle tide. Emily said, I will learn words that open doors. The promise steadied her breathing. Jacob glanced over and pretended not to see. He arranged apples with too much care, giving her quiet. Thank you, she said, not sure to whom. The market noise softened into a rhythm that carried her forward. By noon, Emily followed rumors to a textile shed near the river. The machines roared like cages, windows sweating with steam. A foreman eyed her muddy hem and looked past her hope. No openings, he said, voice clipped. She held her chin high and answered, I can work the spindle and mend tears. He smirked, then mentioned Mr. Grayson with a shrug that felt like a gate slamming. We do not cross him, he added. Emily stepped back, heat flooding her face. I will not belong to him, she said under her breath. Outside, the river glinted, cold and swift, as if urging her not to drown in their indifference. Afternoon faded as Emily reached a small reading room beside a chapel. Dust hung in amber beams, and the hush felt sacred. An older woman looked up from a ledger, gaze sharp and kind. You seek light, she said, as if naming a star. Emily nodded, throat tight. Books can teach the climb, the woman added. My name is Mrs. Ellis. Emily said, I want to choose my hours and my worth. Mrs. Ellis smiled, placing a worn primer on the desk. Start with words, then build a bridge. Emily touched the cover like a door handle. Hope clicked inside her chest and did not let go. Morning light gilded the reading room, and Emily traced letters like seeds on soil. Mrs. Ellis watched with a proud, quiet smile. You plant a future with every word, she said. Emily answered, I will not be owned by fear. The bell outside clanged, sharp as a warning. Two men paused at the doorway, coats wet, eyes empty of kindness. The room closes early, one muttered, leaving a folded note. Mrs. Ellis read it, color draining from her face. He intends to inspect and tax our shelves, she said. Emily felt the walls lean with the threat. Mr. Grayson does not like light, she whispered. Mrs. Ellis placed her hand on Emily's shoulder. Then we will be a lamp that refuses to dim, she replied. Emily breathed in dust and courage, and the air tasted like brass. The lesson continued, but the letters trembled with the coming storm. At noon, the market throbbed with barter and rumor. Jacob waved Emily over with a tight grin. Warehouse shift pays in cash, he said. She studied his eyes and found a flicker she could not read. Whose warehouse? She asked. He swallowed and shrugged. A friend of a friend, he said. Rain threatened again, heavy and low. Emily said, I can carry more than people expect. Jacob laughed, but it sounded brittle. Just keep your head down, he advised. She felt the primer's weight in her satchel like a vow. I will keep my head up, she said instead. He looked away, and worry crawled into her bones. The crowd pressed closer, and the road seemed to narrow into one dark door. The warehouse air stank of rope, grain, and old rain. A foreman ticked names while chains clinked like cuffs. Emily lifted sacks until her arms shook. Faster, he barked without seeing her face. She whispered, I am not a shadow. The door boomed, and Mr. Grayson strode in, coat dry as arrogance. Workers stiffened, eyes sliding away like minnows. New hire, he said, stopping at Emily. She met his gaze and held it like iron. I choose my hours, she said. His smile was thin and cruel. You own nothing, not even time, he answered. Laughter scraped the walls, and the clock hands seemed to stall. Emily felt her will bruise, but it did not break. The foreman marked a debt she did not owe. The hook sank deeper into the day. Dusk smeared the river with tarnished silver as Emily found Jacob by the crates. "You knew it was his," she said, voice steady as rope. Jacob flinched and glanced at the warehouse door. "He promised me a stall license," he confessed. Emily swallowed the hurt like bitter tea. "You sold my hours to buy a sign," she said. His face folded with shame. "I thought he would spare you," he offered. "He spares no one," she replied. Wind rattled loose tin, and the water slapped stone like slow applause. Jacob reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "Do not touch me," she said, eyes hot. "Earn your name back with truth." He nodded, small and pale against the growing night. Night sealed the village like a lid, and Emily stood outside the locked reading room. A notice was nailed crooked on the door. "Inspection and closure pending," it read in heavy ink. She traced the letters with a shaking finger. "He fears what I will learn," she said. Footsteps approached, and Mrs. Ellis appeared with a lantern. "They cannot shutter a mind," she said. Emily felt her chest lift like a sail catching wind. "Teach me anywhere," she pleaded. Mrs. Ellis nodded and pressed the primer into her hands. "We study by riverlight," she said. Emily smiled, fierce and aching. "Then, let the river witness my vow," she answered. The lantern flame leaned with the breeze, and the street tasted of rain and iron. The riverbank glimmered with moonlight as Mrs. Ellis traced letters in the primer. Emily echoed each word like a promise stitched to breath. "Steady, child," Mrs. Ellis said. "Knowledge steadies storms." Gravel crunched behind them, and lanterns bobbed like cold suns. Two clerks stepped from the dark with stamped papers held high. "By order of Mr. Grayson, these books are seized," one declared. Emily felt the night tilt, and her name slid from the page like a tear. Jacob hovered near the path, cap low, eyes refusing to meet hers. "Is this you?" she asked, "or fear wearing your face?" He answered nothing, and silence cut deeper than steel. Mrs. Ellis squared her shoulders and said, "You may carry paper, but not permission." The clerks took the primer, and the river swallowed Emily's breath. Morning broke hard and pale as Emily faced a ledger inside the warehouse office. The columns bled red with debts she never owned. "Sign or work them off," the foreman said, tapping the page. She studied the witness line and saw Jacob's name inked neat as betrayal. "You sold my hours again," she whispered, voice dry as ash. Mr. Grayson leaned in the doorway, amused like a cat at a cage. "Paper is a river that always runs downhill," he said. Emily pressed her palms flat and felt splinters bite. "I do not drink from your river," she answered. Jacob stepped forward, hands shaking, and said, "I thought this would end it." "It multiplies it," she replied, and the room seemed to shrink to the size of her rage. Grayson slid a key across the desk as if mercy had metal edges. "Accept my terms," he said, "and the ledger sleeps." Emily stared at the key like it was a shackle masquerading as light. "Your terms are a cage," she replied. He described housing, meals, and hours that swallowed the sun. "You will be safe," he added, voice polished and poisonous. Jacob whispered, "Take it, please." Emily looked at him and saw a boy trying to rent forgiveness with her future. "You mistake quiet for safety," she said. Mrs. Ellis waited at the doorway, eyes steady as harbor stones. "Walk out," she urged. "Let the key rust alone." Emily pushed the key back with one finger and felt her hands return to her. Wind drove dust like needles as Emily reached the lot where her shack once leaned. The structure lay flattened, boards snapped like ribs under a boot. A placard flapped on a nail, shouting, "Condemned in black slabs." "He erases what he cannot own," she said, tasting rust. She knelt and lifted a plank, finding her mother's button glinting like a stubborn star. "I will not lose you," she whispered, tucking it into her dress hem. Jacob appeared at the fence, pale as chalk, and said, I tried to warn you. Emily stood slowly and met his eyes without shelter. You warned yourself, she answered. The sky darkened, and a storm brewed like judgment. She turned from the ruins and walked toward the river, refusing to bow. Rain arrived in a hard sheet as Emily stepped onto the market square. People scattered, and canvas snapped like flags in retreat. She faced Jacob beneath a crooked awning where truth had nowhere to hide. Say it plain, she demanded, voice clear as thunder's edge. He swallowed and said, I feared losing everything, so I traded you. The words hit like stones, but they did not break her bones. Then lose me, she said, and keep the mirror. Mrs. Ellis joined her, lantern hooded against the storm. Walk, the older woman said. Let the square remember your back. Emily turned and moved into the rain, shoulders straight, eyes forward. Behind her the market held its breath, and the downpour washed the square a fierce, honest clean. The storm's rage had passed, but the air still hummed with sorrow as Emily followed Mrs. Ellis into a modest cottage tucked near the woods. The fire crackled in a stone hearth, the scent of sage and bread softening the walls. This is no palace, Mrs. Ellis said, but the roof is mine, and tonight it shelters you. Emily lowered herself onto a worn bench, her body aching yet her spirit unwilling to bend. She whispered, I cannot be grateful and broken in the same breath. Mrs. Ellis poured tea into chipped cups and replied, You are allowed both. Gratitude is a hand, grief is the weight it carries. Emily closed her eyes, inhaling steam, and thought of her mother's voice again, echoing like a half-remembered hymn. Morning painted the cottage in honey light as Emily stepped outside to gather water. A man stood by the well, tall and steady, with lines of hardship etched across his face. Daniel, Mrs. Ellis said from the doorway. An old friend, and now your protector. Emily's eyes narrowed with suspicion, and she asked, Why protect me? Daniel lowered the bucket, rope groaning, and replied, Because once someone did not protect me. His gaze carried the weight of unspoken scars, yet his voice was steady as the earth. Emily studied his weathered hands and saw honesty carved into their calluses. She whispered, Then teach me to stand, not to hide. He nodded, and a faint smile tugged his lips. By midday, Daniel placed a wooden staff in Emily's hands. Balance, he instructed, is not just for fighting, but for standing. She swung clumsily, the staff smacking against the earth. He laughed softly, a sound more human than his scars suggested. Again, he urged. Sweat streaked her face, but determination stiffened her posture. Mrs. Ellis watched from a stool, a quiet smile betraying pride. The world will try to take your stance, Daniel said, but if your feet hold the ground, no man owns you. Emily gasped, breath ragged, and whispered, I will not fall again. Her voice trembled, but her grip steadied. For the first time, the weakness in her arms felt like the beginning of strength. That evening, Daniel set bread and stew on the table. Emily hesitated, her hunger battling her pride. Eat, he said, strength must be fed. She lifted the spoon and murmured, It tastes of mercy. Daniel shook his head. It tastes of earned survival. Mercy does not last. Survival does. Mrs. Ellis added, And wisdom teaches you which is which. Emily ate slowly, each bite a reminder that her body was worth sustaining. Tomorrow, Daniel said, you carry wood from the forest. Hardship builds the spine. Emily met his eyes, defiance softened into trust, and she answered, Then my spine will carry more than wood. Night stretched deep, and the fire dwindled to embers. Emily sat near the hearth, tracing the button sewn into her dress hem, the last relic of her mother. She whispered, I will carry you forward. Daniel entered quietly, leaning against the doorframe. The world will not hand you freedom, he said. She turned, firelight catching her determined eyes, and replied, Then I will carve it. Mrs. Ellis added from her chair, Every star begins in darkness. The silence after was not empty but full, of resolve, of shared burden, of fragile hope. Emily held the staff across her knees, and in that moment, she no longer felt like prey but the beginning of her own protector. Morning fog clung to the river as Mrs. Ellis unlocked a narrow cabinet in the chapel wall. The hinges sighed like secrets. She drew out a folded parchment wrapped in linen. "Your mother trusted me," she said. Emily steadied her breath as the seal cracked softly. The page listed wages, a land parcel, and a name written twice. "Margaret Hale," Emily read, "and claimant, Emily Hale." Mrs. Ellis nodded, eyes bright with old fire. "Grayson hid the parish copy, but I kept the ledger leaf." Emily felt her chest open like a door to weather. "He called me nothing," she said, "yet I have a name on land." Daniel stepped from the aisle's shadow and murmured, "Truth is leverage when hands hold." Emily closed her fingers around the parchment and said, "Then I will learn to pull." By noon, Emily walked into the warehouse office carrying the parish leaf like a lantern. Grayson looked up, amused and bored in the same breath. "Another petition," he said. Emily placed the page on the desk and said, "A claim, not a plea." The foreman leaned closer, pupils narrowing. Daniel stood behind her, an anchor in plain clothes. "Wages unpaid and land withheld," Emily read, voice steady as river rock. Grayson's smile thinned into wire. "Records burn," he said, "and smoke owns nothing." Emily met his eyes and answered, "Smoke cannot erase names." Jacob slipped in, pale and silent, and whispered, "I can witness the ledgers." Grayson waved the guards, and the room filled with iron feet. Emily straightened her spine and did not step back. The guards moved, but Daniel stepped forward with a voice like a bell. "Stand down," he said, "or face a sworn affidavit." Grayson laughed softly, yet his fingers tapped a restless code. Jacob pulled a small notebook from his apron and said, "He kept shadow ledgers, I copied tallies." Emily lifted the parish leaf beside the notebook, until the columns kissed like proof. "You stole my hours," she said, "and now I steal them back." The foreman shifted, reading sums he already knew were true. Mrs. Ellis entered with 2 parish clerks and a seal. "Bring justice to paper," she said. Grayson reached for the page, but Emily's hand did not shake. "You cannot snatch me from my name," she said, and her voice did not blink. Thunder gathered like witnesses as the dispute spilled into the yard. Rain started, quick and cold, pinning eyes to truth. Grayson shouted terms that sounded like chains. Emily raised the parchment high, and the crowd leaned in. "This land and labor are mine in law," she said. Jacob stepped to her side and declared, "I wrote every theft." Mrs. Ellis lifted the seal and pressed it to wax on a copy. Daniel faced the guards and said, "Choose pay over prison." Their boots hesitated, and their hands dropped an inch. Grayson lunged, but Daniel caught his wrist like a doorstop catching wind. Emily's voice rang through rain, "I will not return to silence." Lightning cracked the sky open, as if verdicts lived in light. A gust tore the original leaf from Emily's grip, and the page sailed toward the river. She ran, dress heavy, feet striking puddles like drums. Daniel shouted, but she did not slow. At the embankment, she leapt and caught the parchment against a post. Grayson's cry vanished in the storm. Emily turned, water roaring like crowds waking. She raised the soaked page and shouted, "My name survives the flood." Mrs. Ellis's seal gleamed on the copy held high by a clerk. Jacob bowed his head, tears honest at last. Emily stood taller than the weather and said, "I claim my hours, my land, and my life." The storm could not swallow the sound. Morning rose clean after the storm, and the village felt rinsed of lies. Emily stood by the river with parchment, drying in the new sun. Daniel said, "Wayne tried to claim you, but you held." She answered, "I held because the truth had weight." Mrs. Ellis joined them, lantern unlit, and said, "Now we move from proof to practice." Jacob approached with eyes reddened by a long night. He said, "I will testify to every theft." Emily studied him, and heard the river testing stones. She said, "Words matter when they change hands, not hearts." Jacob nodded, shame softening into effort. Daniel pointed to the far field where weeds hid lines of old fences. He said, "Land remembers names better than men." Emily breathed deep, and the day answered with quiet strength. The parish hall smelled of ink and beeswax as a clerk copied Emily's claim. Quills scratched like small oars rowing toward shore. Mrs. Ellis said, "Paper is a bridge when truth walks it." Emily replied, "Then let my feet be firm." Daniel stood by the door, a quiet wall that bent for kindness, but not for threats. Jacob swore his oath with both hands open. He said, "I profit now by telling everything." The clerk sealed the copy and stamped the registry. "Claim recorded," he announced. Emily felt the sound settle into her ribs like a steady drum. She said, "I return ours to their owner." Mrs. Ellis smiled and answered, "And you return a name to its house." Outside, bells marked noon like a curtain lifting. In the market square, whispers turned into sentences that did not fear their endings. Mr. Grayson faced the clerks with a lawyer's thin lips and colder eyes. He said, "You mistake charity for right." Emily replied, "I mistake nothing that bears my name." Workers formed a slow ring, not loud, but present. Daniel stood at her flank, and the guards chose distance over duty. Mrs. Ellis read the entry aloud, so no ear could pretend to miss it. Jacob added dates that matched debts like teeth in a gear. Grayson looked smaller without thunder to lean on. He said, "You will regret this." Emily answered, "Regret is paid to fear, and I owe it nothing." The square exhaled, and a different weather began. By evening, Emily walked the boundary of the field now written with her claim. Grass brushed her ankles like a greeting withheld for years. Daniel said, "Soil answers to care, not cruelty." She replied, "Then I will learn its language." Mrs. Ellis placed a small spade in Emily's hands. She said, "Work is a prayer when it builds." Jacob stood at the gate, uncertain, and asked, "Can I repair what I broke?" Emily weighed his words like seed. She said, "Repentance is a season, not a sentence." He nodded and fetched posts to straighten the fence. The sky softened into rose and copper, as swallows knifed the air. Emily pressed her palm to the earth and felt it recognize her. Night came without menace, and the cottage windows breathed warm light onto the yard. Emily sat on the step with the staff across her knees, and the button stitched at her hem. She said, "Mother, the road is mine now." Daniel leaned in the doorway, watchful and at ease. He said, "Freedom holds when hands keep learning." Mrs. Ellis rocked near the hearth and added, "And when minds keep reading." Jacob stacked the last post by the fence and lifted a shy hand. Emily rose and faced the dark that once swallowed her. She said, "I forgive, but I do not forget." The wind moved softly through the trees like pages turning themselves. Emily whispered, "I am Emily Hale." The night kept the name and gave it back brighter.